10 years since the beginning of the US-led war on terror began. 10 years in Afghanistan's long history in which politicians have promised and then promised again that the country is healing and that peace, security and human rights were being returned to the people. But what's the reality? Is progress really coming? Has it stalled? Or did it never really get started?
The United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps in Afghanistan.
And the targets selected, if successfully destroyed, should permit an increasing degree of freedom over time.
Let us all together fight the perception that things are going wrong in Afghanistan.
Responsible transition of our forces out of Afghanistan.
We must reach out to all of our countrymen, especially our disenchanted brothers.
Amnesty International has released a scorecard that assesses the state of human rights in the country to see if the high hopes for Afghanistan in 2001 have been fulfilled. One of the justifications for the 2001 military intervention was to improve women's rights, which under the Taliban had been dire. New laws and the election of women MPs to Parliament with a guarantee of 25% of the seats has been progress, but those appointed to positions of actual power is well below international benchmarks.
خشونت علیه زنها هنوزم دوام داره. خشونت بسیار جدی. زن متاسفانه که هنوزم مظلوم است. از اگر کسی انکار کنه دروغ میگه.
Violence and discrimination against women in general continues despite minor improvements. The scorecard shows that Afghanistan is still one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a woman. The reconciliation with the Taliban began in earnest in 2010 with international agreement that women's rights had to figure prominently in any talks.
In practice, what we can see that the Afghan government itself is meeting the preconditions of the Taliban rather than Taliban meeting preconditions of Afghan government. Women's exclusion from the process, lack of transparency in the whole process, and not knowing what are the red lines and non-negotiable rights are still unknown.
This was Kabul's first ever rock concert, and there have been improvements in freedom of expression and opinion, although less so outside the capital. There is no doubt that there's more information to go on now. Since the 2001 collapse of the Taliban, independent media has flourished, with radio stations, newspapers and TV stations springing up. But with this increase in activity, so has the violence increased against journalists and media workers. And while in government-controlled areas access to the healthcare system has dramatically improved, Afghanistan still suffers from the second highest rate of maternal mortality and deaths among under fives in the world. For any country to flourish, it has to allow people access to education. Since the removal of Taliban-era restrictions, around 7 million children have started school, 35% of which are girls. Still, in the 9 months leading up to December, 74 schools were destroyed or closed because of attacks. These facts show the courage of the pupils and teachers and their daily struggle in the face of discrimination. What has the government done? Well, it has a good record of drafting national laws and adopting international human rights standards, but putting laws into practice has been poor. The creation of a proper legal system generally hasn't given justice to women who've had crimes committed against them. Arbitrary arrests by the US military, the police and other security forces are widespread, and they continue to use unacceptable methods such as secret and indefinite detention without proper legal process and torture. The lack of security is a blight on the scorecard. In the past 10 years, the number of civilians killed in fighting is around 13,000, but the fear that comes with fighting has affected the entire population. When are the Afghan people going to see a proper system of justice and compensation? The latest estimates are that nearly 500,000 people are internally displaced, having left their homes too afraid to stay or for a better way of life. Many are living in appalling conditions with no proper shelter, food, water, healthcare or access to education.
If I would rank it and give it a score of a human rights state in Afghanistan, I would say that it has been failed to fulfill many of its promises to protect human rights of Afghan people in the past 10 years.
The Afghan government and their international supporters cannot continue to justify their poor performance by saying that things are better than during the 1990s. The international community has repeatedly said it will not abandon the Afghan people, but it looks increasingly uncertain that they'll stand by this commitment and ensure that rights are not swept aside as they look for a way out of Afghanistan.